Hi everyone, welcome back to ACE ISC Psychology, where we will be continuing our chapter on psychological disorders. Today, we will be covering childhood disorders, ADHD, autism, and separation anxiety disorder. Your syllabus is very specific here. It only asks for definitions and symptoms for each of these, not causes. That makes this one of the shortest videos of the chapter, but don't underestimate it. These are easy and guaranteed marks if you know the definitions precisely, and a lot of students skip revising this section properly simply because it feels too minor. So stay tuned, this will be a pretty short video, and as always, I will share tips and common mistakes you should avoid to ace your board exams. Let's get started. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, meaning it originates from differences in brain development, typically appearing in childhood. ADHD is defined as a persistent pattern of inattention and/or hyperactivity impulsivity that interferes with the child's functioning or development, appearing across more than one setting, for example, both at home and at school. Before we get into the formal symptom list, it's worth pausing on what this actually looks like in a child's day-to-day life, because ADHD is one of the disorders most likely to be misread as something else entirely for years before anyone considers a proper evaluation. In play, a child with ADHD often moves from one toy to a game to the next one quite quickly, struggling to stay on with a single activity for as long as their peers do, not because they are bored in the way any other child gets bored, but because sustaining attention on one thing takes a level of effortful control that does not come easily to them. In group games, they may struggle to wait their turn or blurt out moves before it's their go, which can seem inconsiderate to other children, even though that's rarely the inattention. In studies, this often shows up as child who seems bright in conversation, but whose written work does not reflect that. Assignment started but not finished, instructions followed halfway through before attention drifts, homework that gets lost between the desk and school bag, and so on. Teachers will sometimes describe this kind of child as smart, but does not apply themselves. And that phrase itself is worth remembering, because it's often exactly the moment where ADHD should be considered rather than a simple lack of effort. Socially, the impulsivity piece tends to be what draws the most attention, such as interrupting conversations, struggling to wait their turn, acting before thinking through a consequence, and so on. Peers can experience this as disruptive, even though the child usually wants friendships just as much as anyone else. The difficulty is in the self regulation, not the intention. And here's an important real world pattern. ADHD very often goes undetected for years, particularly in children, whose presentation leans more towards inattention than hyperactivity. A hyperactive, impulsive child is disruptive and visible, so adults tend to flag it early. A quieter, inattentive child, who might just seem like a daydreamer, a bit disorganized, or a bit forgetful, can sometimes go unnoticed for a long time, sometimes being labeled as lazy or unmotivated throughout their whole school life before anyone connects the pattern to ADHD at all. This underdiagnosis pattern shows up especially often in girls who more frequently present with the inattentive type. ADHD falls into two symptom clusters. The inattention symptoms include difficulty sustaining attention on tasks, being easily distracted, appearing not to listen when spoken to directly, difficulty following through on instructions, being forgetful in daily activities, and avoiding tasks that require sustained mental effort, such as homework. Symptoms of hyperactivity impulsivity include fidgeting or difficulty remaining seated, running or climbing in situations wherein it's inappropriate, excessive talking, difficulty waiting for their turn, interrupting or intruding on others, and acting without thinking through the consequences. Important ISC exam tip is that if you're asked about the symptoms, structure your answer around these two symptom clusters, the inattention and the hyperactivity impulsive cluster, rather than listing symptoms randomly. Examiners can award marks more easily when your answer is organized this way, and it also helps you remember more symptoms under exam pressure. Next, we come to autism spectrum disorder, which is also a neurodevelopmental disorder, but it centers on two very different areas: social communication and restricted or repetitive behavior. Autism is defined as a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction, along with restricted, repetitive behavior patterns, interests, or activities. Autism, like ADHD, can show up in ways that are easy to misread, sometimes as shyness, sometimes as being particular, or sometimes simply as a child who's seen as a bit different without anyone naming why. In play, this often looks like a child who plays alongside other children rather than genuinely with them, that is physically present in the same space but not engaging in shared, reciprocal play the way their peers spontaneously do. There's often a strong preference for solitary or repetitive play, like lining up objects in a precise order, spinning something repeatedly, or returning again and again to one specific, intensely absorbing interest, whether that's trains, planets, numbers, or a particular topic, well beyond what would be a typical passing phase for another child. In study, the same intensity of interest can actually become a real academic strength. Many autistic children do very well in subjects that reward pattern recognition, memorization, or attention to detail. Where it becomes harder is open-ended group work, or in tasks that require inferring what someone else is thinking or feeling, like interpreting an actor's or character's motivation in a story. Rigid adherence to routine also matters here. Something as small as a substitute teacher or a rearranged timetable can cause a level of distress that seems disproportionate to the change itself, because predictability isn't just a preference, it's often a genuine coping mechanism. Socially, unspoken social rules, like how close to stand to someone, when it's your turn to speak, what particular facial expression or tone of voice means, often do not register automatically, the way they do for most people, and have to be learned more consciously. A child may talk at length about their specific interest without picking up on the other person's waning attention, or come across as unusually blunt or literal, simply because sarcasm, idioms, and implied meaning aren't always intuitive. This is also a disorder that frequently goes undetected for a long time, especially in what used to be called higher functioning presentations. That is, a child who is verbally articulate and does well in academically settings, but can have social difficulties written off for years as simply being shy, quirky, or a very particular kind of kid. This is again especially true for girls, who are often better able to consciously copy and mimic the social behavior of peers around them, sometimes called masking, which can hide real underlying difficulty until the social demands of adolescence or adulthood become too complex to keep the masking successful. Autism also falls into symptom domains. Symptoms in social communication domain include difficulty with social emotional reciprocity. For example, not naturally engaging in back and forth conversation. Deficits in nonverbal communication, like eye contact, facial expressions and gestures, and difficulty developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships appropriate to their developmental level. Symptoms in the restricted and repetitive behavior domain include repetitive motor movements or speech, an insistence on sameness and rigid adherence to routines, highly restricted and intense fixated interests, and unusual sensitivity or reactivity to sensory input, such as light, sound, or texture. Another important ISC exam tip: just like ADHD, structure your autism answer around these two core domains: social communication deficits and restricted or repetitive behavior, rather than a mixed up, unordered list. This is the exact structure the DSM based classification uses, and mirroring it in your answer signals a stronger understanding to the examiner. Our final disorder in this video is separation anxiety disorder. And note that this falls under the anxiety disorders category, even though we are covering it here alongside the other childhood-specific disorders, because your syllabus groups it with ADHD and autism under childhood disorders. Separation anxiety disorder is defined as excessive fear or anxiety concerning separation from home or from major attachment figures, such as a parent, that is developmentally inappropriate, meaning it goes well beyond what's normal for the child's age. Because every child goes through some phase of separation distress, this is one of the disorders most likely to be dismissed as just a phase for far too long, which is exactly why it's worth understanding how it actually plays out day to day. In play, a child with this disorder may refuse to play at a friend's house unless a parent stays close by, avoid sleepovers altogether, even when another child is going, and need repeated, ongoing reassurance that a parent will actually come back before they can relax into the activity at all. Even brief moments of a parent stepping out of sight can trigger real, visible distress, rather than the quick passing protest more typical of younger age children. In study, school refusal is often the single most visible sign. A child who repeatedly complains of stomach aches or headaches, specifically on school mornings, symptoms that tend to ease off remarkably well once they are told they can stay at home, which again is a very strong clue that the physical complaint is anxiety driven rather than medical. Even when they do make it to school, concentration can be difficult because part of their attention stays fixed on worry about a parent's safety or about what might happen at home while they're away. And some children develop check in behaviors, like asking to phone home partway through the day just to confirm everything is fine. Socially, this can also affect a child's standing with peers, such as avoiding overnight camps or events that classmates manage easily, or being seen by other children as being unusually clingy or babyish for their age, which itself creates its own secondary social difficulties on top of the anxiety itself. This disorder often goes undetected precisely because some separation anxiety is developmentally normal, especially in toddlers, which makes it genuinely hard for parents to know when it has crossed the line from expected to excessive. A child who is still showing intense separation distress well into middle childhood may simply be labeled as sensitive or clingy for years rather than being flagged for evaluation. And school refusal is particular if often misread as defiance or simply disliking school, when the underlying driver is actually anxiety about the separation itself, not the classroom. Symptoms include excessive distress when separated or when anticipating separation from home or attachment figures, persistent and excessive worry about losing an attachment figure or harm befalling them, reluctance or refusal to go to school or to be away from home, reluctance or refusal to sleep alone or away from a major attachment figure, repeated nightmares involving the theme of separation, and repeated physical symptoms like headaches or stomach aches when separation occurs or is anticipated. The word examiners look for is developmentally inappropriate. A toddler being upset when a parent leaves the room is completely normal. This disorder is about a level and duration of distress that is excessive for the child's actual age. Always include this distinction in your answer. It's often the difference between a partial and full marks response. Now, coming to some important exam tips and common mistakes to avoid. High yield areas or things you must absolutely spend time learning. Number one, clean memorized definitions for all three disorders. These are short, precise, and easy to nail if learned word for word. ADHD's two symptom clusters, inattention and hyperactivity impulsivity, as well as autism's two symptom domains, social communication and restricted repetitive behavior. Where students lose the most marks is skipping this section entirely during revision because it feels too short than easy guarantee marks, or writing vague everyday descriptions instead of the specific defined symptom clusters that we discussed. Also, adding causes for these disorders is not necessary because your syllabus explicitly does not require them. Finally, what to avoid by studying this chapter. Do not overstudy because the syllabus is pretty definite over here. You need to know only the definitions and the symptoms, so keep your revision note short and precise. Do not memorize ADHD and autism symptoms as one long, undifferentiated list. Always split them into their two respective categories and domains. Finally, do not forget that separation anxiety actually belongs to the anxiety disorder family, even though for your syllabus it's grouped under childhood disorders. That's all for today. As always, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more exam-oriented content, and feel free to pass this along to your friends and classmates who may be appearing for board exams. In the next video, we move into schizophrenia as well as psychotherapy, which will be a slightly longer video, but also the last one of this chapter. So see you there.